on, check it out.
To me, there's nothing like the ocean. I feel like it's a sacred place.
Yeah, hold up the sun. Oh, you can actually see like the plankton in there.
It feels like one ancient, vast entity. A beating heart. And it's this translator between the elemental and the fundamental and the microbial. The ocean is where all this becomes so clear. It is the purest alloy of life. There's this allure that almost pulls you in. How I feel about the ocean is hard to put into words, but a poem by the physicist Richard Feynman gets pretty close. I love the ocean, and it's through this connection that I can see it's desperately warning us. So, my name's Duncan, and this is my film. I've dedicated everything to this for the past 2 years, all in respect to its message. In 2024, we exceeded a global average temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, making it literally the hottest year in recorded history. The current level of action being taken towards combating climate change has proved ineffective. I'm here to show you how the noticeable effects to vital ecosystems today tells a much more serious truth about the tipping of our planet's fundamental balance, and what this means for your and my future. But this isn't some nature documentary. I'm not here to entertain, but to inspire real change. First, let's get specific, though, because climate change is a global issue, but I'm here to zero in on coral reefs being not just one of the most diverse and vital ecosystems on Earth, but, in my opinion, the most breathtaking. It's the first coral reef I've ever seen. It was like a dream. But you turn a corner and this huge portion of it is just destroyed. Strangely, I actually expected to see this. I'm an art student, but I sort of grew up a scientist. Ever since I was a kid, I've been really fascinated by specifically aquariums and fish and kind of biology in that department. I would memorize like encyclopedias cover to cover. One time I had 4 fish tanks at once, and it changed the humidity of my parents' house. But when I was 15, I made a short film project on climate change and how heat spikes had been seen destroying massive amounts of coral reefs around the world.
The environments it creates are the building blocks for coral reefs. You can't have coral reefs without coral, and you can't have the fish that live in coral reefs without coral. So it's really like the trees in a forest.
So 6 years later, when I finally saw a reef in real life, being so aware of all this destruction, I was actually kind of surprised to see any reef left. Let's go back a bit. To reiterate, I'm here to inspire, but first I need to truly understand and communicate what the actual problem is here from the ground up. So, what killed these corals? Let's start with that. To zero in on a root cause, I wanted to see if I could reproduce what happened to these corals in a controlled setting by changing just one variable: temperature. But I couldn't just stop there. To give my hypothetical experiment context, I also needed to witness and document these ecological events myself as they were happening, to truly understand what this means not just for corals, but for oceans and our planet today. At the time of getting started, I was, to say the least, underqualified. Picture a 19-year-old art student with limited hobbyist experience in keeping coral, on a razor-thin budget, and on a time crunch against the coming summer months on the reefs. I didn't have any kind of scientific resume, credibility, or even a dive certification. To start, I figured I would need some guidance, so I reached out to a ton of different scientists and researchers doing similar work.
No one is taking me seriously. People just don't respond. But I would love if anyone were to email me back,
I decided to get started anyway without an advisor. So the whole plan was kind of a shot in the dark, but the clock was ticking, so I hit the ground running. Using my knowledge of the ocean, water chemistry, and hobbyist experience with coral, I devised a plan to mimic a real-world temperature spike, recorded by the Australian Institute of Marine Science across several locations on the Great Barrier Reef in my apartment. My goal is to show how heat actually affects corals in a controlled setting, and to offer a frame of reference for real-world observations. It was crucial my experiment was as accurate as possible, so first I needed 2 different kinds of healthy coral to ensure my results weren't species-specific. Then I had to maintain ideal water chemistry and all other environmental factors to create the perfect environment for these corals. I kept this up until I was confident that nothing would interfere with my results.
Okay, the silicone is in. See the water level draining from the pump? And then that's my return pump, but why is it so low? So it's going over, but I don't think there's enough space for it to go under. And the pump is pulling pretty hard, so I think it's out-pulling the amount of water that can come under. So what I'm gonna do is I think I'm just gonna grab a drill bit. This was too low, so I cut it a little bit. That's why there's all this crap flowing around. But so far, no change. Man, there's so many issues happening right now. I just learned it's not level. All right, so that's that all carved out a bit lower. This one as well. Best just get to it. And I actually shimmed it up here on these shims because it was a little bit out of level. I don't know if that's the stand or I guess maybe it would be the floor. Okay, so I just put the water in again after trying to fix the baffles of the sump, and it actually works. It works so well. I'm so happy. It produced all these shavings, and I was like, I gotta filter out these shavings. So I was looking around my house for things that I could use to like filter it, and I was like, I have a bunch of steel wool left over in salt water. Never use steel wool as filtration, yo.
But yeah, I literally rinsed it, scrubbed it like a million times. You can see right there the magnetic surface collects all those little pieces of rust. All right, so after scrubbing all the parts individually and like literally like a 500% water change, I've installed a little bit of filter floss, which is catching some of the rust and stuff. You can see there's still kind of a lot left. After months of designing, building, troubleshooting, and rigorous water testing, I finally felt confident enough in my system to add coral and begin acclimating it to the environment. A lot was riding on this, and I was really nervous. I feel like I'm diffusing a bomb right now. And far from smooth. I then conducted my experiment. So I spent around 9 days simulating a temperature spike based on the highest recorded temperatures at multiple locations, including Thursday Island, Davies Reef, Cleveland Bay, Heron Island, and Lizard Island. This landed me on a high for my experiment of about 31.5 degrees, which, although is arguably on the hot side, it is not inaccurate to the data I referenced, and is more than realistic for more common temperatures projected in the near future.
Good morning. Today is February 8th, and it's getting hot in the fish tank. We're going up another 2 degrees, 82 degrees today, Fahrenheit.
After starting the simulation, 6 days after the heat spike began, I observed the corals began to turn white at about 30.6 degrees. This phenomenon is known as coral bleaching. February 11th, temperatures are currently at about 31 degrees. And I'm just going to keep it there for a couple of days and just monitor the effects. Both the corals are really stressed. They're closed. Starting to see bleaching on both of them. Quite a large amount, actually. By the way, it's Super Bowl Sunday, so my roommates are having kind of a party. Bleaching got worse as the temperatures rose. Eventually, 5 days later, after undergoing the high of 31.5 degrees, both corals began to show signs of death, despite the temperatures returning to normal levels. So this real-world heat spike killed both of these species of coral. But how? The temperature was only a few degrees Celsius above typical summer heat for a relatively short amount of time. To understand what happened, first we have to look into the fundamentals of how these animals actually work. So, what is coral? So it's not a plant, it's an animal, and it has a mouth. And the mouth is called a polyp, and some corals even have hundreds of polyps, but it's hard to actually describe coral because they differ so much species to species. For example, some are called soft corals. They're squishy, but on a reef are elegant and can look like trees or flowers waving in the wind. But a lot of the reef-building ones actually have hard skeletons under their skin that they use to create reefs. Now, typically in nature, though, the colors are pretty drab for coral. You'll see shades of reds, browns, very common, a little bit of yellows and greens, with the exception of captive bred corals like the ones I used for my experiment, which have been specially bred to be super bright colored. But naturally, not really the case.
Corals are incredibly resourceful animals. They're a beautiful example of symbiosis.
Although many coral species have at least one mouth, they rely on an entirely different technique for the vast majority of their sugar intake: gardening. Inside the coral tissue, they give shelter to an entirely separate organism, a tiny algae called zooxanthellae. As sunlight hits the coral, it's soaked up and photosynthesized by the algae, and as it grows, the coral farms it. It's not only essential for the coral's sugar and protein intake, but it also gives coral its color. But in the case that the water's a little bit too warm, the zooxanthellae become stressed and can no longer process sunlight as they were before. The coral realizes its plants aren't bearing fruit and assumes something's wrong, so it purges its system and flushes out all the malfunctioning algae. This can be seen by the naked eye as the coral physically turns white, dispelling all the colorful plants that make up its farm. If the water temperature returns to normal levels, corals can adopt back the algae and start up their farm again. But if it stays high, this means the coral is devoid of its essential food source. So, if it stays white for too long, the coral will starve to death. But heat isn't the only threat for coral. Atmospheric carbon dioxide absorbs into seawater as carbonic acid. As this compound changes states and breaks down, it releases imported hydrogen ions into the water. This in turn changes the ocean's pH. So, more CO2 in the air leads to more acidic seawater. This is known as ocean acidification. pH is an incredibly sensitive balance throughout biology. For example, the natural pH of human blood ranges between 7.35 and 7.45. But a fluctuation from this of just 0.2 or 0.3 can result in comas, seizures, and even death. The importance is the same in the ocean. Even a small change impacts a vast network of chemical systems. Despite corals being highly adaptive and resistant, when these two phenomena happen at once, it proves a very serious threat for the entirety of reefs. Corals are also full of fluorescent proteins, which are useful for attracting prey and discouraging predators. These proteins are particularly visible at night with the blue light or in captive-bred aquarium corals, selectively curated to show the most colorful and beautiful possibilities of the animal. Remember zooxanthellae, the tiny algae within coral's tissues we compared to plants in a farm? Sometimes on reefs, as zooxanthellae become stressed from heat and start to lose their ability to process light, too much sunlight can actually stress them out even more, like a domino effect. To try to manage this and save as many zooxanthellae as possible, corals can boost their naturally fluorescent proteins across the surface of their skin to try to make a sunshade for their garden, thus changing a bleached white coral to an unnaturally bright neon color, ranging from glowing bright blues and purples to highlighter pinks and yellows. These corals are just as stressed and starving as bleached coral, but as a last-ditch effort are using precious remaining energy to build a sunshade, trying to de-stress or welcome back their garden, hoping it will be enough to produce them more valuable sugar before it's too late. So what's the significance of all this? The threat here is not in the concern of the existence of corals as animals or their extinction. It's about the function of the coral reef in terms of the ecosystem. Reefs are vastly important to oceans. They support a quarter of all marine species at some point in their life cycle and essentially support a whole branch of the tree of life. Just like how there's no rainforest without trees, with no coral, there's no coral reefs. So the destruction of these animals is like that branch cracking off, taking everything relying on reefs with it. But their importance doesn't end there. 500 million people rely on reefs' vital role to the fishing industry. The Great Barrier Reef alone is a $56 billion tourist attraction. It is economically a foundation for several massive industries. Not to mention, culturally, reefs are vitally important, and at the bare minimum, reefs act as irreplaceable shoreline protection for countless cities against the open ocean. The point here is the ocean is like a big sponge, a sponge that is able to absorb huge amounts of excess heat and carbon with relatively little noticeable terrestrial effects. But as atmospheric CO2 exponentially builds, the ocean buffers are starting to become overwhelmed, and eventually they will irreversibly corrode. This is like rolling down a slope and then suddenly falling off a cliff. Bleaching is a warning of this cliff approaching. The entire concept of this film, Dying Reefs, is just an example. Melting glaciers, forest fires, these are all natural warnings. It's the Earth telling us that its fundamental systems are being altered, and this is just the beginning. So we know how excess heat affects corals and how they work biologically, but how is climate change actually affecting these ecosystems today? After months of persistent emailing and networking, a handful of scientists had finally started to respond to my emails. As a result, I had caught word of a projected bleaching event across the coast of Australia in March 2024, even sooner than I had initially estimated.
It's bleaching in March, so I gotta be there in March.
So, within days of concluding my experiment, I got on a plane and headed for the Great Barrier Reef. Specifically, I planned to document the conditions off Townsville and at the Heron Island Research Station off Gladstone. But first, I'm off to the world's most advanced research aquarium facility, Ames National Sea Simulator. Being too young to rent a car at the time, I took a motorbike 50 kilometers outside of Townsville, Australia to visit this facility, to learn about the current cutting-edge science in coral restoration, specifically about the possibility of breeding heat-resistant corals that could continue to support reefs in much hotter oceans. In the ocean, corals commonly reproduce by spawning. They release millions of eggs onto the reef that can then be fertilized before settling as new colonies. Corals spawn based on very specific environmental cues of temperature, moonlight, and tides. The Sea Simulator is a facility that can be compared as a much more advanced and versatile version of my home experiment. But here, everything is done with razor precision and sometimes on a massive scale.
Yeah, so each one of those tiny little specks you see is a fertilized embryo. what'll happen is we keep it inside these tanks for about 7 days or so while it fertilises from the night before into a larvae, a free-swimming larvae that's cannulated. And then eventually it'll become competent, which means it's ready to settle onto a reef structure. These are about 2 years old now. So this room here is where we grow out the recruits. After we settle them from larvae, they turn into coral recruits, and we grow them out in this room for various experimental purposes, or to grow them up into sexually mature adults or sexually mature F1s. These aren't frags. These have all actually been grown by sexual mature.
From those tiny little eggs.
Yeah, exactly. So one of those tiny eggs is then settled onto conditioned aragonite plugs. So these have been conditioned in the system with the crustose coralline algae, which, like I said, is a settlement inducer. So we have a PVC tray like this into a settlement tank filled with these plugs, and then we release larvae into the tank, and if they're competent, they'll actually grow onto these plugs. As you can see, very, very tiny. This is a Cropora millipora from December 2023. So these corals are going to grow in a few years into the size that we've just seen, and then in 5 or 6 years they'll be sexually mature adults, as long as we...
That's so cool.
That's tiny, aren't they?
So it's like Super Coral Iteration 1?
Yeah. Yeah. And then the goal of a lot of these breeding programs in aquaculture is to get the F2s, which means the filial second generation, which is the offspring from the F1s.
Okay.
And what that means is that you've closed the life cycle because you've completed the whole life cycle of that species in captivity, which we have for a lot of these species that serve here.
The facilities mimic ocean environments so flawlessly, corals here actually spawn as they would on a reef, unaware they aren't in the ocean. Not only that, but Lonnie explained to me that he and his team are even able to trick corals into a 6-month offset of spawning, allowing for restoration work to continue throughout the off-season.
Could we get the corals to spawn when we lot? Could we get them to spawn in winter, which is 6 months before they normally would in the wild? And the answer is yes, which is fantastic.
Really? Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah. Not only is this 6-month offset, it's 5 hours offset, which means we get them to spawn 5 hours before they shoot.
Okay.
So we're not hanging around till midnight. We're actually getting them to spawn around 2 p.m. So workability is a lot better.
Right.
And we also managed to settle them into those juvenile recruits, which we've seen.
Right.
Which means, again, we've closed the life cycle of more species, but we've done it, 6-month offset.
So these are the F1s on that offset.
Yeah.
That's so cool. So you're able to accelerate the science by skipping the downtime. So from collective wild coral species, the CSIM is able to complete and repeat the entire life cycle of coral in captivity all year round. But corals grow slowly, and climate change is exponential, so the current scientific frontier of coral restoration is about exploring techniques to actually speed this process up.
So this is one of the projects we do on asexual reproduction of corals. So we've been exploring microfragmentation, which is when you take a little small frag from a colony, and when you make a microfrag, which is the size of your little fingernail, about 8 by 8 millimeters, in certain species, it kickstarts some rapid growth. We'll get a better footage of it. So this is a concrete pyramid with nearly 100 microfrags of Platygyra from the same genotype. So these have undergone rapid growth when they were first glued onto this structure. And what happens is that when they meet each other, they actually fuse because they're the same colony, essentially. And once they fuse, the idea here is that they'll start pulling their energy, or switching their energy rather, from growth into reproduction. So they'll thicken up and then start to develop gametes inside the colony. So that was generated from wild broodstock. That's 8 years old now, and that's how big it is. You can compare it to the
From the other, and that one's only 2.
That's 3 years old now, I thought.
So less than half, and it's like way bigger.
So there was talk at some stage to try and investigate that, because if it was a gene that you could turn on in just normal corals, you could get them to undergo fast growth, which would be obviously have quite a lot of meaning.
These facilities and their capabilities are truly incredible, but it still remained unclear what restoration strategies were actually being explored here and how they could be applied to bleaching reefs. To find out, I spoke with Dr. Holland Elder, who is currently conducting research on the possibility of breeding and distributing heat-resistant corals onto a reef.
The primary driver of coral bleaching is certainly heat stress. And it is a combination of the temperature of the water and the amount of light that the coral is getting, but the amount of light stays consistent. However, our oceans are getting warmer. The range of temperatures that they can endure is not very high. And we honestly don't know. We don't have an exact number for how much further they can adapt. That's part of my job, is trying to figure that out.
Right, okay.
Yes, there are differences in species, but again, to keep the reef ecosystem intact, you do need a biodiverse ecosystem. So you need all the species that are fulfilling all of those roles on the reef. So you wouldn't want a reef that's populated by just one coral.
Right. So you can't just have the boulders that don't mind or
Exactly. So in this room, we're running a moderate heat stress experiment. No heat stress is happening right now. The corals are just acclimating to kind of the tank conditions because they came out from the reef. So Davies Reef, which you modeled your experiment off of, is where these corals came from.
Oh.
So does this moderate heat stress test reliably predict which individuals out on the reef that do well and do not do well? And we know this because we tracked the corals.
Okay. And these are taken from the colonies that are tagged?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Does breeding and implementing stress-resistant corals, whether it be through like dispersing eggs or actually putting frags and everything, kind of help ensure the presence of like coral in the ocean, or is it possible to really like rebuild a reef from methods like that?
This I do want to be super clear about. So we cannot adapt corals to the temperatures that are projected. We have to do something about climate change. We have to bring emissions down, or we will not, because we just cannot, corals will not survive.
Yeah.
But like the restoration work that we're doing right now, that is to give people methods that will allow them to maintain their reefs in coming years if we bring carbon emissions down.
Right.
But it's just so important to know that if we don't bring the carbon emissions down, all of this restoration work will not be worth anyone's time. I don't think that we can quite overstate the importance of science communicators, and artists can be science communicators, because the average citizen has to understand this. Scientists write in journals that are not always accessible to everyone, and we write in jargon that wouldn't be accessible to everyone unless you've taken many biology courses. So I think we can't overstate the need for good science communication, because if people don't love something, they're not going to care enough to save it.
I took a ferry 80 kilometers off Gladstone to a place called Heron Island. It's an offshore reef, and I went there to document the conditions of the corals. I spent 9 days there, and I was on the reef all day, every day, pretty much just documenting everything I could. So, Heron Island consists of two sections, a research station and a resort hotel. On the ferry over, I was one of the only ones heading to the station, and when I arrived, it was largely empty. The research station manager, Dr. Stuart Kinnenman, explained that a lot of the field science regarding bleaching had already been done. We know what is happening and we know why. Research around the actual reef and bleaching now mainly consists of conservation efforts, like the work conducted at the Sea Simulator. But for Heron Island, from my perspective, it seemed like the facilities are primarily educational nowadays, hosting students, school groups, and journalists like myself.
This all right here is just dead. So you can kind of see it's sort of a gray now. And it almost looks like it's just a pile of rocks. But this is all dead here. So right here is a good example. So you get the bleached, and then you get the dead portions where it's got algae growing all over it.
So it's just all pretty much as far as you can push. All directions. The majority of the island's population belongs to the resort. People were enjoying their tropical white sand vacations, and after a couple interactions and observations, it quickly became clear that essentially none seemed at all concerned or even aware of the vast ecological devastation happening all around them. It's silent, blanketed by the turquoise vacation dream water. But I genuinely wasn't prepared for what I saw on the reef flat. Just fields and fields of bleaching. The reef crest is an area of a coral reef that meets the open ocean. Here, corals are deep, large, and strong. The currents and crashing surf can be very dangerous, so it was important I didn't go here during my documentation. However, near the end of my time at Heron, I set off alongside the station manager and Dr. Ove Goldberg to multiple known dive and survey sites on Heron Island's reef crest. At these sites, ancient, huge resilient corals were up to 25 feet below the waves. Generally, bleaching affects corals closest to the surface, where light is intense and water is warmest. So what we saw here was unheard of. Coral colonies so large they are classified as massives were not just severely bleaching, but literally glowing. These corals were fluorescing as a response to heat stress. Based on the severity, the team agreed they would be dead within a few weeks. This was intensely shocking to not just me, but to the scientists who had been surveying the site for decades.
But the massives, almost every single massive is iceberg. Yeah. Normally you get some which are bubbling forward.
Exactly, because they're in the low light areas of the reef.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Duncan, you're so lucky to see it right at the moment.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking another month it's going to look pretty ugly.
It'll just be all dead, yeah.
The coral colonies had bleached here before. Dr. Kinnenman, who had been surveying the site for decades, however, had never seen anything this severe.
Yeah, see, all that's normally pretty close to 100% coral, where there's, you can sort of see that shallow area extending to where those lights are. And now,
Yeah.
So we've come to look at a site which normally is a really beautiful place. It's a great popular dive site with the resort and with scientists to do their work. And we had been warned that there would be some, bleaching. But I wasn't prepared for the amount that I saw, and we've never seen anything like that in this region.
I did the surveys, and you saw a lot of bleaching in spots, but you could quite happily find areas that were sort of escaped, and consequently the recovery was very fast because there were colonies around, and it was all kind of good. But this is a whole different. This is another scale up from what we saw back in those years. Yeah. This is going to revolutionise. If this is a taste of the future, this is really bad.
Sure, yeah.
It was the perfect time to see it. The highest peak intensity of bleaching and fluorescing right before death. And on such large colonies, at this depth, this was rare to witness. I had to document it as much as I could, so Dr. Ho Goldberg and I set off again, later that afternoon, to another dive site near the reef crest. The timing couldn't have been better to witness all this devastation at its most severe. After so much work, I had succeeded in my project. I'd done what had felt so impossible. But actually being here wasn't entirely a good feeling. Seeing this ecosystem as it literally falls apart before your eyes with hardly anyone taking notice is really depressing. But then you realize, this is why I'm here. So let's talk solutions.
Yes, I mean, when you think about what we're talking about, which is the collapse of an ecosystem that has, well, arguably more species in it than anywhere else in the world, perhaps not the Amazon. But you take that and you look at the value of it and so on, you realize there's a very powerful argument there to preserve it. But the problem is we're not putting the effort into changing what we do to make it a reality. I think we've got to put those people on the block, the governments on the block, and say, look, you know, we love your work, right? But you've got to be honest about it. And only if you're honest about it can we then do something about it. And I think it's that, but we've got to do that. Now, how do you do that? I'm a great, not to send the youngest over the top of the line, but you know, I think it's got to be young people who are taking this personally. If you think about it, will be taking this personally. One thing about the effect of climate change on coral reefs is it's an easy to understand story. You know, it's about a beautiful ecosystem that's important to people. It's about the damage from global climate change to that system, and then the knock-on effects to people. So I think there's a story there that can be told where people will start to understand. And that's why I think it's a really great idea that what you're doing is to take something that's straightforward and really tease out why we're not responding. You know, why are we not responding? Now, and at the same time, dare I say, it's time to be angry.
Yeah.
Coral reefs are vitally important and beautiful, but they also stand as an irrefutable current example of the planet warning us of the dire sincerity that this issue must be addressed with. It's a systemic problem that requires a systemic solution, but it's not until the majority shifts their morals and values that this issue can be addressed on the scale that is needed here. And that's not unrealistic, like that is the biggest obstacle. The technology to address this problem already exists. It's just about changing people's perspectives to not just understand, but to prioritize this as the genuine emergency it is. Those are the key words. It's education and priority, and that starts with you and me. With stories like this, you gotta take the science, the facts, communicate it, translate it, and share it. Because it's about making a wave of understanding and importance throughout the culture. A wave big enough to topple all the division, the greed-fueled misinformation, the political agendas, because this supersedes all of that. It's more important. Something throughout this project I've kind of come to realize is approaching the problem of climate change really does start with the individual. But first, let me clarify, I'm privileged. I'm very lucky to have been able to allocate this much time and money towards this project, and I'm not asking you to do the same. But if you are in a privileged position like me, it is your responsibility to make the wave. To take this film not just as media to entertain you, but as an example, an idea, to use whatever resources you can to be the change. That said, even in the smallest way, everyone can do their part. Like just a conversation. If you're inspired, pay it forward. Share these stories, share this feeling, because I am counting on you. We all are counting on you. And if not for anything else, do it for you. Because if it hasn't already, I promise you that if left unchecked, there will come a day when the effects of this crisis directly affect you. And by then it'll probably be too late, so let's not wait. Because this is in our hands today.
It's an exciting world. I mean, yes, there are challenges, but they're feasible, they're tractable, and it's going to be an exciting, 100 years when people your age start to get into the age bracket of when we were predicting these problems. And being able to, I hope, and I'm pretty sure it'll happen, where you can sit back on your chair and say, you know what, we took action, we changed the course of the world, and look how beautiful it is.